which was good.
So you already mentioned your job in New York.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you went to York and then you went back to
UCSB, yeah.
UCSB this time, yeah.
So it mixes personal life and intellectual life some. So I'll mostly focus, I think, on the latter rather than the formal. Nobody's that interested in my personal life. A thing that, a first thing I really wanted leaving graduate school was a job. So I was quite happy to have a job anywhere I could get one. I'm sure any graduate student hearing this will know that that's, just a job. That's all I wanted. But if I could choose a place that I could go, I wanted to go to a place that I could continue to learn, because I knew, I'd had a certain number of years being mentored by Manny and John and Steve. I knew I had a lot more to learn. And of course, the other thing I picked up very quickly was that although we talk about conversation analysis, there are really different flavors that are different strands or types of work that people do. And clearly the work that Manny does is very different than the work that John does. And I think John and Steve are closer together because they collaborate a lot, but I can always, if it didn't have a title, I could tell this is a Steve Klayman paper, So the possibility of going to York and working with Paul Drew seemed, was like a dream. His work, I think of to this day as, so distinctly original and foundational. To me, it has a very strong kind of Goffmanian influence, and I think probably most apparent. He is his own distinct person, but you can see a lot of Gail Jefferson's influence in his work and the way he approaches things. And so I was just so grateful that I could go and work with Paul, and I learned so much. I was there for less time than I wanted to be. I ended up going back, as I said, for personal reasons that I won't mention here, but I'll just say that I was very, very reluctant to leave York. It was not what I wanted. It was not what I wanted intellectually, and I think Paul had built a group at York that was just, clearly really outstanding. And again, it was a really rich intellectual environment. So it's not just that Paul was there, but within a few years, Celia Kitzinger was there, Richard Ogden was already there, John Local was already there. This is a really powerhouse group of people, and I learned so much from them. So, I dealt with prosody to a certain extent in my dissertation, but I went and took a class from Richard Ogden in phonology and phonological linguistics, and I just learned a tremendous amount about how to hear and how to listen and how to see the connection between different aspects of prosody and action formation. And I still think of him, and John Local, who was really also really influential for me. I think, I could see from John Local a way in which you could take conversation analysis and apply it to institutional settings in a way that was quite different than what Paul and John were doing at the time. I think John Local was working with British Telecom, and so it was a much more technical application, and I think that ended up shaping. I did some work on speech recognition, and I really, was inspired by John Local there. So it was just, it was really a dream come true to work there. But there were family circumstances that took me back to the Bay Area. As it happens, I had also had a job at Xerox PARC. So I actually went back and worked at Xerox PARC for a couple of years with Marilyn and Jack Whalen, which was also a really great experience. And Eric Vinkhausen was there, and Bob Moore, and Peggy Szymanski. And that was my first chance to work on a team, and I think there I really learned that I love being on a team. I like collaborating with people. As a human, I'm a social person, and so I really loved working on the teams that they put together. But I also could tell pretty quickly that I wasn't cut out for corporate life. It just wasn't for me. I'm not good at having a boss. I think that's probably why I had some of the conflicts I did with Manny. Not that he ever asserted himself as a boss, but I was working out some issues. So I was kind of looking out for jobs, and the UCSB job came up, and that was, if I could land any place, that was sort of beyond something that I could dream of, because it was, working with Gene Lerner and Don Zimmerman and Tom Wilson, and then Sandy Thompson and Mary Buchholz, who's there. It was just a really great place, and there are a number of other people there who I've just really enjoyed working with. So I was so fortunate to get that job. I don't know why, out of the range of people that they could have hired, they picked me, but they did, and they're stuck with me now. That, I think, part of being in Santa Barbara has also shaped my work in a different way. The Department of Sociology there is much more critically oriented, and so I think some of the work that I'm doing now on policing is inspired in some ways by that much more critical orientation. Though I think nobody in my department thinks of me as a person who does critical kind of work, because, in the first place, I want to understand, and I think that was Manny, a big influence that Manny had on me, was that our job is to really understand, and just to understand, and that's a real contribution in its own right, because understanding has to be kind of the foundation of whatever we do.
Yeah.
So I've been really, I look back, I think I've been so fortunate in the places that I was at school and the jobs I've had and the kind of people I've had a chance to work with. Yeah.
So in a lot of your work, you look at grammar, even though your background is not in linguistics, it's in sociology. So what do you think is the role of grammatical resources in talking interaction?
I think I've been, well, first of all, I think I've probably got a number of things wrong because I'm a sociologist rather than a linguist. For example, calling things yes-no interrogatives, which is, sort of linguistically specific rather than polar interrogatives. I think I initially had them as yes-no questions, and Sandy disabused me of the use of that kind of language. I was conflating grammar and action in various ways. So I had a lot to learn. But I was kind of convinced, and this was a Gene Lerner influence, especially from his work on collaborative completions, that grammar was a fundamentally social form of social organization. That it had to, well, initially, his work was showing its work in projecting the possible completion. And I think he's done such amazing work on turn-taking around that. But that if it had that central role, it must have others. And so that's been an effort a kind of central part of what I've tried to do is understand the social basis for grammatical forms, I guess is one way of putting it. And that I think what I came to see about yes-no interrogatives or polar interrogatives is that they maximally constrain the range of responses they make relevant next, and that's a sequential practice, not a turn-taking one. And so that really opened my eyes to the possibility that grammar could have these very different social dimensions. And so, I think that opened up the door to some of the stuff in epistemics that John and I have done together, although, I think it's really important to say that I can remember way back in graduate school, well, clearly John has been working in the domain of epistemics well before we ever published that paper, his work on O, and I just remember from data sessions, John talking about this person's domain versus that person's domain, and so he'd been talking about things that were related to epistemics a long time before we did the terms of agreement paper. And it was a kind of funny accident, the terms of agreement paper, because what we set out to do initially was, I had described this practice of confirming in my dissertation. So you get a yes/no interrogative, and you can get yes it is, or you can get it is yes. And in privileging confirmation over responding to the interrogative, that speakers were doing something very specific with that seemed to be related to what speakers were doing with O. And so our initial project, what we planned to do was just to compare that part of my dissertation with John's work on O, and that was what we were going to focus on. And it just turned out to open up this other domain, and that, I think, at least as I remember it, and I, again, emphasizing the degree to which John had been working on these things a lot. So John would say things like, going first entails the claim of epistemic priority. And I said, well, the Manny in my head said, well, how do we know that, And so we were looking at a piece of data, and I wanted to know what the evidence that going first entailed such a claim. And it was a so-prefaced initiating action in which someone used seems. So it seems that, and so they were downgrading the firstness of what they were doing, and they were downgrading the claim of epistemic primacy in what they were doing. And I thought, oh, well, there's some evidence that they are avoiding doing something that going first would otherwise do, where they're dealing with a default presumption about that sequential position. And I think that's when things started to open up. Let me put it differently. That's not when things started to open up. That helped me to see what John was talking about, and I think gave us a way of seeing how our respective findings could be usefully folded into a depiction of a quite different kind of social organization than we described before. And that's how we ended up writing that paper. And it was a really, I think I spent about a week visiting John's house, maybe 3 or 4 days. And I just remember that being such a heady experience. And we'd work in the morning, and we'd go walk around the block and talk about things. And it just, just had a sense that we were onto something. And that was, I think that's a thing about CA that I really love, is that there can be the sense of discovery, the sense that you found something that you don't think anybody else has seen before. You can figure out whether that's so, whether the thing you think you've seen is actually there, and whether anybody has seen it before, or has seen it in the way that you have seen it. I think that I was hooked. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's fun.
So you mentioned some of the projects you have worked on. So for instance, the project with the police. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and other projects as well.
Sure. So I kind of got to work on the police by accident. I'd long been interested in police, but just sort of, I like detective novels, that kind of thing, and so. And had been interested in policing for various reasons, but didn't ever see a real serious way of working on it. Somebody at UCSB had some access to police data, but we could never kind of work out an agreement where I could do it. But then I was contacted by a funding agency that wanted work done on policing, and would I be interested in doing that? And I said, of course, and so they this funding agency got me access to the police departments to begin collecting the data. And so that was kind of how I got into it, as an institutional matter. But I was also interested in policing because so much of what conversation analysis has been about, quite appropriately, has been cooperative occasions between people who are kind of trying to collaborate with one another and doing the things they do. There had been work on conflict, by Tony Wooten and others, going way back. But I was very interested in finding out what we could learn about interaction by looking at coercion, which is a big part of policing, and conflict. So I also have a project now with Brett Bowman and Kevin Whitehead on violence. So the work on policing was partly inspired by this effort to get at this sort of spectrum of interaction that I think hadn't really been looked at very much. I was interested in this more coercive aspect of the coercion in interaction, and also, it was really clear to me from the work that John was doing, that Tanya Stivers was doing, and Doug Maynard was doing on medical interaction, that we could take the same kinds of methods and apply them to other institutional domains. And in the U.S., there's been a kind of slowly and slowly unfolding and increasingly dire crisis in policing. And so I thought, maybe we could make some small contribution to changing how things work in those encounters. So there were a range of things that I thought might be of interest, and I think that's how we got into it. Yeah.
Oh. So could you say a little bit about what you found and how
sure.
How the sort of research became then?
Yeah. So. The first project that we were asked to do by the funding agency had to do with reducing the use of force. And what could you do to make it less likely that police would engage in violence to compel conduct by civilians? And a thing we noticed early on was that there were two basic environments where police used violence. One was where civilians did things like run away, and that seemed, I think there are ways that we can address policing and police conduct to make it less likely that people are going to be fearful in that way. But that seemed more like a kind of distant problem. But the other main environment was where police were trying to get civilians to do something, and it was often very early in the encounter. They were trying to get the civilian to come over to the car, or to sit down, or to turn around, or to put their hands behind their back. So there's a range of ways in which they're organizing and controlling the body of the subject. And a thing I noticed in one of the kind of more dramatic clips that we found early on was at the time that one of the police officers was trying to get someone to do something, the other person wasn't just sort of cavalierly rejecting the officer's authority and saying hell no, or whatever more extreme versions people might say. They were trying to do something else. And so they would say, I'll sit down, but first I need to do this. So that suggested to me that the problem of cooperation in police encounters wasn't so much a matter of deference to authority, although that's a part of it, but that people were trying to do diametrically opposed things. So to illustrate the example, in one case, the police show up at a convenience store, and there's been a disturbance inside the the convenience store. The report over 911 is that a white woman was using the N-word in a conflict inside the inside the convenience store. So the police arrive, and they walk in, and they encounter a white couple, a male and a female, and a young African-American guy. And the young African-American guy says, honestly, sir, I have no issues. So he immediately tries to begin establishing that he's a bystander to the encounter, and it seems pretty clear that he wants to get that done before the police do anything else. And one can understand in the current environment, I think he would be naive to think that the police were likely to view him as an innocent bystander, especially if he didn't know what was happening in the phone in the 911 call. And the police officers are saying, well, let's go outside. And the project for the police was very simple, which was to get people out of the store and separated before they have a discussion of who's who. And so what we have is what I think of as a kind of sequential standoff. Each of the participants is trying to do something that makes collaborating in the other project problematic. So the police can't decide who's who before they go outside, otherwise they're not, the thing they're trying to do is completely undermined. and the civilian can't go outside before establishing he's innocent or the thing he's trying to do. So it's not just a rejection of authority, but you have this problem of competing projects. And the standard way that police officers deal with this is by saying, let's go outside, let's go outside, let's go outside, or I'll make you go outside. So, you know, you repeat the command and escalate. That seemed not to be very effective. And we found a number of encounters where this happened, where the police officer would say, I understand you want to tell me who you are, but first we need to go outside. So we coded some data and looked at this, and you know, it was a pretty striking finding. It turned out that if the officers used if the officers acknowledged that the civilian was trying to do something, so they used this, I know you want to do X, but first we're going to do Y. So they arranged or dealt with this sequential standoff as a sequential problem. We'll do one, then the other. The odds that the civilian would cooperate with the officer's next directive, if it was said within 15 seconds, you know, if it was shortly after that, the odds they would comply with the next directive increased by 10 times.
Wow.
And the odds that the police officer would use force in the encounter overall decreased by 20 times. So, you know, there's this very tight linkage between cooperation and acknowledgement that, not surprisingly, cumulatively produces a very dramatic shift in the likelihood that police officers would use force. So that, for us, suggested that we could say something kind of very basic. I mean, I don't think it's a particularly striking insight into the psychology of humans, or, you know, that acknowledging people is better than, you know, sequentially deleting them. I mean, I don't have any illusion that this was some grand insight, but it was clearly news to the police that this was effective in that way, and that we could show it and explain to them why it was, and it was a pretty small shift. And so that gave us the idea that we could do something. But I also had, and I haven't published that paper yet, partly because I'm a very slow.
Can you share?
Oh, of course, yeah. I've presented that work a lot of places. I'm a pretty slow writer for a variety of reasons. But a main reason I haven't wanted to publish it is that it was also really clear to me that I didn't know policing and the world of police and sort of the institutional dynamics of policing. I mean, so we've all gone to the doctor, you know, we kind of have a sense of the world of the doctor, you can understand the world of the doctor. I think the world of the police officer is a very foreign one to most of us. And so I really didn't want to publish anything on policing until I had a sense that I could look at videos and understand, whether I agreed with it or not, understand what the police officer thinks they're doing and doing what they're doing. And so I really wanted to take some time to get into the world of policing, to do a lot of reading about policing, to ride with police officers. I now co-teach a course with a police officer.
Wow.
So it's given me a chance to kind of, you know, gain some experiential knowledge of the world of policing that now makes me much more comfortable to say things about policing and have a sense that what I'm saying isn't completely, you know, doesn't reveal me to be a complete naive when it comes to, you know, completely novice when it comes to policing. And I think, you know, I think that the degree to which you need that sort of background knowledge really varies by the institution you're trying to study. And I think given, you know, the consequences of getting it wrong for the police, you know, I really wanted to have a sense that that I wasn't going to put anyone in danger, you know. So.
Yeah. Wow. So I guess one of my final questions is to do with the projects that you're currently working on or planning to start. What areas you're involved in?
So I'm currently working on a couple of different projects. One is a collaboration with Kevin Whitehead and Brett Bowman on violence. Brett Bowman is a really smart kind of social scientist, kind of social psychologist, but his background is more in epidemiology, and so kind of much more quantitative. And he'd been studying violence. He's South African. He's at Witwatersrand in South Africa, and been studying violence in the global South for a long time. was really increasingly unsatisfied with the degree to which the current epidemiological approaches to violence really got at what the mechanisms of violence were. And Kevin Whitehead was a colleague of his, and they were having conversations. And so they started, Kevin started talking about his work on race and conversation analysis. And I think Brett found that compelling, and Kevin found what Brett was doing compelling. And then they invited me to join based on the work I'd done on policing and the capacity for small changes in interaction to reduce the use of violence. So we started collaborating on a project, and we recently published a special issue in the journal Violence, and it has a kind of range of approaches, including ethnomethodological and conversation analytic approaches to understanding the real-time organization of violence. And so we have a paper there, and we have a number of other projects that are trying to get at, one is the sort of overall structural organization of violent occasions, and that also gets you something like the range of underlying social and sequential positions that make violent conduct meaningful in specific ways, which I hope, when we kind of can lay that out, provides both a way into understanding how violence happens in encounters, but also could possibly be used as the basis for a kind of coding scheme for understanding in quantitative terms what's happening in the moment-by-moment organization of violent occasions. So that's a big part of what I've been doing and will continue to do. And then I think there's just a ton of work to be done in epistemics. I think I remember when I first came to York, I met a person who did work in conversation analysis early on, and then had gone on to do other kinds of things. I won't say who it is. And they said, there's nothing left to do. They've already figured out turn-taking, sequence organization, repair, and storytelling. What else is there? Initially I thought, oh my gosh, she's right. They've nailed it. What else? And then I thought, no, wait a minute. I think we barely have a grasp of what, this gives us a toehold to begin to understand a whole bunch of other things that are happening. And so I'm glad I didn't listen to that. And I think the same can be said for any subdomain. I think there's a lot about sequence organization we don't know. I think there's a lot about epistemics that we don't know. We're barely opening that area up. So I have a range of projects on epistemics that I'm interested in. And then a project that kind of cuts across the police and the epistemics that I'm interested in has to do with trust and how do we see and understand what trust consists of, which kind of returns to some of the early work Garfinkel did, and alternatives to trust, like suspecting someone of wrongdoing or that kind of stuff. So that's where a lot of my work is now.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it's fun, and I think like a lot of. I find the fact that I spent my life as a conversation analyst really fortunate, because I think most of our relationships, at the point we make when we teach this is most of our relationships are constituted through interaction. So I've got to spend my life so far trying to understand this thing that's a big part of who I am and what I do, and I think the things that I'm looking at now in terms of trust and suspicion are parts of people's lives too, and they're kind of sometimes more difficult parts of people's lives, and so I think it's worth trying to understand those as well, and in that way understand ourselves and our experiences better.
Yeah. So thank you very much
for
such an amazing interview and for sharing so many fascinating stories and memories.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be interviewed. I'm really looking forward to this.